WPSU is your source for Penn State sports, Penn State research, Penn State community. But we can't do it without your support. Make a contribution today and get a DVD of your favorite Penn State show.
Alzheimer's disease affects about 4 million Americans and is the leading cause of dementia among the elderly. But patients diagnosed with the neurological disorder aren't the only people suffering. Our next guest says that caring for a loved one can be one of life's most stressful experiences. He'll share important coping strategies. Let's take note with Stephen Zarrett, Penn State Professor of Human Development and Assistant Director of Penn State's Gerontology Center. He's also a board member of the National Alzheimer's Association and an adjunct professor at the Institute of Gerontology in Sweden. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Discussions about Alzheimer's often center around the 3 C's, the cause, care, and cure of Alzheimer's, or for Alzheimer's. Let's begin with the first C, the causes. What do we know today about what causes Alzheimer's?
The exact cause hasn't been pinned down, but a lot of the speculation is that something goes wrong in processing a particular protein in the brain called amyloid. That amyloid gets cut in the wrong place by an enzyme so that the resulting piece is toxic and starts to cause inflammation and damage in the brain.
What you do know is that Alzheimer's is a disease of aging. There are currently 4 million Americans with Alzheimer's, and we have a population whose lifespan is steadily increasing. What are the ramifications of that?
It really means that as our population ages, we need to plan for the eventuality of having to care for a lot of people. When most people didn't live beyond age 65, Alzheimer's wasn't a big problem. But the high incidence of the disease, the point at which we're at the most risk of it, is from 75 on. And now, for instance, a college-educated woman can expect to live to age 90. So her risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or one of the other degenerative brain diseases is quite considerable.
And in fact, research I read indicate that fully 50% of those over age 85 do have signs of Alzheimer's disease, which, as you were indicating just a moment ago, means that the potential for any one of us to have to care for someone with Alzheimer's increases as well. What is the toll for caregivers?
It's really considerable. There's of course the stress associated with care that affects caregivers' mental health, and studies have routinely shown that between 40 and 65% of caregivers experience significant feelings of depression. But there can also be a toll on a family member's health. There are some studies that show that caregivers' own health suffers, and that a very stressful care experience can actually shorten their lives.
Now, you've done considerable research in the U.S. and also in Sweden on coping strategies for caregivers. First, tell us a little bit about that research and then what you discovered.
We've looked at a lot of different kinds of strategies that reduce the burden on caregivers. Many people conceptualize the problem as there's a disease which is stressful and there's nothing you can do about it. But what we found is that how people respond to the disease, how they respond to the very specific things that happen on a day-to-day basis can make a big difference. So that a starting place is giving family members adequate information about what the disease is, answering their questions, and giving them a perspective for understanding the changes in behavior. One of the problems that happens frequently is a patient will ask the same question over and over again. And a family member may get irritated and upset by this, feeling that the patient should be able to control his behavior, or feeling that he's lazy, he just isn't trying. If the family member gets information about the disease, he or she can come to understand that this is something that the patient can't control. It's not being lazy. It's really a matter of impairments of memory.
So instead of snapping You asked that question 10 minutes ago. What would be an appropriate thing for a caregiver to do?
One thing would be to say, to answer it again. Another thing would be to recognize that sometimes these questions have an underlying feeling attached to them. And while you can't address the content, is it lunch? No, it's not lunch. You can address the feeling, which might be irritation, boredom, anxiety. We once saw a woman who was actually in an institution for care of people with Alzheimer's disease who was driving the staff crazy by asking all the time, "I want to see my mother." And the staff wanted to reorient her to reality and say, "Your mother's dead." And that would make the situation worse. And we finally got the head nurse to think about, what is it someone feels when they ask to see their mother? And the nurse came up with the hypothesis that the woman wanted some comfort, some attention. So the next time the woman said, "I want to see my mother," the nurse took her aside and said, "Let's sit down and have a cup of tea and talk about your mother." And of course that dealt with the problem.
It's interesting because you point out in some of your work that punishment and rewards, for example, also don't work for Alzheimer's patients, but distraction does.
That's right. Now, reward sometimes can work, but distraction works, activity works to head off problems. One of the biggest things that we're seeing in our new research is that people with Alzheimer's can't initiate their activities, they can't sustain activities. Left to themselves at home, they'll sleep an hour or two during the day, and of course that affects their sleep during the night. They're not likely to be tired. They're going to keep the family member up and so
Right,
on.
and when we're talking about Alzheimer's patients, we're talking about care that's required 24/7.
That's right.
Which is part of the reason why I think you suggest that respite care and sharing the responsibility of caring for a family member needs to be shared.
That's right. I think it's a very rare person who can do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Most people need breaks. Sometimes families get enough help from within the family to do that themselves, but most often it means bringing someone in from the outside or taking the person with Alzheimer's disease to daycare. We've done some studies of daycare and there's some real advantages to that. I think the main advantage is that a good adult daycare program has structured activities for people with dementia. It involves them, it keeps them active during the day. What we've found in our current study is that while patients are sleeping an hour or two at home during the day, when they're at daycare, they're up and active and they're involved in things.
And it sounds as if Alzheimer's patients, of course, have limited memory, but if you keep giving them exposure to certain skills, they can keep those skills longer.
The memory for how to do things is retained. Motor memories are retained longer. So if you can keep someone active, we once, in a study I was involved in a long time ago, saw a man in a dreadful nursing home, not in this part of the country, fortunately, where nothing happened. He was never doing anything. He had no speech left. He was just left to sit all day. He had been a house painter, and for some reason there was remodeling taking place, and one of the painters gave him something to do to help with the plastering. And for 3 days this man was actively working plastering walls.
You point out too that if you can help a patient hold on to some of those simple skills, dressing for example, that it becomes less frustrating not only for the patient but also for the caregiver.
That's right. It means that the person with dementia can stay active longer, but it also means that the family caregivers don't get involved in power struggles over dressing, over what clothes to choose, and so on. One of the things that is very important for the family is to learn to pick their battles carefully. It doesn't matter if clothes match. It doesn't matter if someone wears something twice. It's better to allow patients to experience as much autonomy and control as they can. It's very important for them because all around them they're feeling a loss of control.
And even if it means telling this patient again, day after day, how to even put the shirt on.
That's right. Sometimes you can talk a person through the steps, step by step, rather than doing it. And it requires a great deal of patience, and the more stress you're under, the harder it is to be patient. But in the end, staying patient and having someone do as much as they can for themselves will really pay off.
Witnessing the physical and mental deterioration of a loved one has to be one of the most stressful situations for anyone. But knowing what's coming, I can't even find the words to describe what that must mean. What kind of support is needed for a person who's newly diagnosed with Alzheimer's?
You've touched on something very important. The diagnosis is being made earlier and earlier. We understand the disease well enough that it can now be identified fairly early in the course of the disease, and that's important for the long run. When there's a treatment, it's going to be necessary to implement it early in the disease. But it also means that people are diagnosed now at a point where they understand the implications, and there are some programs that seem to be very promising to help both the person with the disease and family members talk through the implications of the disease. Sometimes it's support groups organized by the Alzheimer's Association that are specifically designed for early stage people, and sometimes it's more formal programs. I've been involved in an evaluation of a program like that in Southern California that seem to have very positive effects both for family members, but particularly for these newly diagnosed patients.
And we're talking about a disease that has a duration of maybe 3 to 20 years. So we're talking about living with this for quite a long time. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but I read that the NIH spent nearly $600 million on Alzheimer's research last year. Give us an idea of where we are in terms of finding a cure for this devastating disease.
The progress has been tremendous in recent years. It may be around the corner, but it could be elusive. It's really hard to tell.
And what final words of advice would you have for someone who's in that caregiving position?
Get help. People don't realize that help will make a difference.
Okay, thanks so much for being with us.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.